start tonight by telling you a little bit of the story of how I grew up to be the person who talks for a living and writes for a living about the connection between finances and emotions, between money and feelings. It goes back to my Jufro era. So that's me, Chicago, Illinois, roughly age 12 or 13. That's where I grew up. Things were going very well for my family for a while. I was, at that point, 12 or 13. My twin brother and sister were 5 years younger than me, went to a great private school in Chicago. We were full payers at that point. Then a couple things happened to change things very dramatically for me and my family. First, my parents got divorced. If you've been through that as a grown-up, or if you went through it as a child, you know that it is dramatic in all sorts of ways. But it is especially dramatic financially. You take one household, you turn it into two. That is expensive, and that is before the lawyer bills start coming. Within a year, one of my parents lost their job. And that parent did not earn any income to speak of for roughly 2 to 3 years. And it was about a decade until my family was anywhere back to where we had been financially. So those years overlapped with middle school, high school, and college for me. So the first thing that happened was that our private school community, Francis Parker in Chicago, rallied round. They made a decision at a board level there that the Lieber kids were not going to be evicted for lack of ability to pay. It's still one of the nicest things that anyone has ever done for me. So me and my brother and my sister all went on scholarship and stayed there for the rest of our time at Francis Parker. When it came time to apply for college, there were not a lot of people in my community who knew very much about financial aid and the system and how it worked. But luckily, somebody slipped us a phone number. It was a little scrap of paper for this guy that we were supposed to call. He was the guy to see if you didn't have enough money to go to college, but we're aiming high in the city of Chicago. And so we called him up, and he gave us this address to come to in Evanston, Illinois. He said, just show up at 4 o'clock next Monday. He said, and bring me $50 in cash. So we said, okay. We showed up here. This is the Office of Financial Aid at Northwestern University, and the guy we were there to see, it turned out, was the assistant director of the financial aid office, and he had an amazing side hustle going on. In the fall, most afternoons at 5 p.m., he would usher in local families, and you'd walk in and you'd go into his door, into his office, and he'd shut the door behind you so nobody in his office could see what he was doing. And you'd drop the $50 in cash on his desk, and then he would proceed to tell you all of the secrets of the financial aid system. Yeah, like which line to put on, what number of what page of this godforsaken FAFSA form that some of you may have been familiar with when you were growing up, or maybe you're getting ready to fill one out now. It is horrible. It is worse than the 1040. It is a completely complicated system, still is today, a national disgrace. But we had to deal with it. We didn't know how, and this guy knew exactly what he was doing. And he told us how to fill out the form, to just, legally toe the line to make ourselves appear as needy as possible without actually breaking any rules. I got into Amherst College early decision. I got an incredible financial aid package, graduated with a modest amount of student loan debt, got it paid back in just a handful of years. So I learned a couple of things from that guy in that place. First of all, that the grown-up world was just chock full of complex systems involving money, and that they were totally made to be hacked. Legally. This guy didn't want us breaking any rules or anything like that, but he knew how to get us through the system. And the other thing I learned, even more important, came from the fact that my mom chose to take me there in the first place. Because she might have left me at home, right? She might have been, ashamed by the situation we were in, or maybe she would have wanted to, shield me from anxiety or something like that. She had a lot of anxiety around money and around this whole college issue and how she was just going to make it work. But she didn't do that. She didn't leave me behind. She thought that I needed to have a front row seat for the entire process because it was going to be my education, right? It was going to be my debt. So why shouldn't I have a full picture of what was going on? So I didn't think much about that place and that guy until many years later. But in 2002, I was applying for a job at the Wall Street Journal, at the personal journal section, the consumer news section that they were starting back then. Sadly, it doesn't exist anymore. But back then, everybody was very excited about it. I went in to talk to these two gentlemen, Eben Shapiro and Edward Felsenthal. Lucky me, huh? So the two of them sat me down, and they had my number. I mean, every one of my numbers. And they said, Ron, what you don't understand about the work that you've been doing so far to date in journalism. You know, I'd had a couple of good magazine jobs, and I'd put out a book or two, but I hadn't really figured out what I was kind of put on the earth to do or to write about. They said, Ron, what you don't understand about what your work adds up to date, they said, your beat, your area of coverage, your beat is beating the system. And as soon as they said that to me, all of these doors and windows started flying open in my head. And when they hired me to help them launch the personal journal section, I started writing stories about things like how to return your wedding gifts for cash. How many of you did that? Thank you. Excellent. Me too. In addition to being incredible mentors, those guys were amazing headline writers. I still remember the headline they put on that one. I take thee back to the store. And so I was off and running. And within a couple of years, they realized that the stuff that they were having me do, the system-beating beat, that turned out to be personal finance too. Personal finance wasn't just all of the sort of stocks and bonds and stuff that the Wall Street Journal has been writing about for decades. It was everything and anything that hit you in the wallet. And it was about the sort of complex emotions we experience around money. And I started writing about all of that. And in 2005, when they started a Saturday newspaper, they gave me a column in the money and investing section. Within a couple of years, the New York Times noticed what I was up to, and they hired me away. So there I was, 30-something years old, right? I've got this column at the Times. I should be on top of the world, right? Well, I was for about like 6 months, and then I became a dad. And there's nothing, as most of you in this room know, that shakes you up quite so much like becoming a parent. And this little girl had very big questions very quickly about money. And I still remember the one that put me over the edge. We were in the car one day, and apropos of absolutely nothing, she pipes up from the back seat and she says, Daddy, age 3, why don't we have a summer house? Right, we hadn't been talking about summer houses. We couldn't afford one. And so I had no idea where this was coming from. So I'm like gripping the steering wheel here, right? And my wife's in the front seat next to me, just sort of, she thinks this is hysterical, right? Because I played Dr. Money in the newspaper on the weekend, kind of answering everybody's questions, and the financial crisis is brewing at that point, and I'm like calming people down, and I cannot deal with this 3-year-old. I'm literally stunned into silence. And I knew that would not do, right? Because while the question was sort of funny at first glance, when you think about it, right, she was asking big, searching questions. She knew that there was stuff out there in the world that other people had that she did not have. And she, at the ripe old age of 3, felt like she deserved an answer about why. And it needed to be an answer that would make sense to a 3-year-old and satisfy her. And I felt like I owed that to her, and the fact that I could not answer her was a parenting failure. Right, so I started taking these questions that she was asking and other questions I was hearing about from older kids, and I would just throw them up on a blog post on the New York Times' website and would just begin kind of answering them out loud. I was essentially creating rough drafts of scripts that parents could use in their own lives. And within a couple months of that, I started hearing from other parents who had complicated questions for me. Ron, they said, we've been out in the community here in New York, and then eventually from all over the country and all over the world. And we're with our kids, and we're on the weekend, and we're seeing all these protests, right, with kids, right? And our kids, at least the ones who can read, are seeing these questions and these signs about bankers, and I'm a banker, right? And what am I supposed to say about this to my child who wants to know what all this is about? And what I was increasingly hearing, right, from the parents who had more money than average, whatever average was in their community, was that people were starting to feel demonized by the conversations about inequality that were going on in their community. They felt like people were pointing to them and saying, you know what, you all really need to tone it down. You people, the one with the, with the nice car, whose kid takes a taxi to school, the ones who had 1,000 balloons at your bar bat mitzvah instead of, just 100 or none, right? All of you just need to chill out. And that didn't feel very good. Those people felt like they were having to apologize, not just for what they had, but who they were. And the people with less than average in those communities, they didn't like the conversations either, because all along they had felt like their noses were being rubbed in everybody else's affluence, often at a time when they were really hurting. And they really did not like the questions that their kids were coming home with, right? Mom, Dad, why did you decide to be a teacher or a rabbi or a social worker when you could have been an investment banker and then we would have a house in the Hamptons like my friends, right? They didn't like that at all. So these parents were coming to me and they're saying, Ron, we've seen all this stuff that you've been doing on your blog. I said, can you just come and talk to our community, you know, the people with more and the people with less, and just set everybody straight? And I thought, wow, okay. I don't quite know how to do that, but this feels like a new question to me, a good challenge, right? In the world of personal finance, where it sometimes feels like there are not a lot of new questions and new challenges. So I took that one on and I thought, all right, well, what's really going on here, right? What do all these people have in common? I tried to think of the single worst word that somebody might use to describe my child that would make me feel like a failure as a parent, just as a starting point for conversation, right? The single worst word that somebody might use to describe my child that would make me feel like a failure as a parent, the first thing that popped into my head was the word spoiled. And I think the reason why it did is because spoiled is not just an adjective, right? It's a verb. Spoiled by whom? Well, spoiled by you, right? By me, by all of us, because they're not born that way. They're made, right? And they're usually made that way by their parents. So I thought, all right, well, if that's what we're trying to solve for, then what's the opposite of spoiled? And I started making this list for myself of all the values and virtues and character traits that add up to the kinds of grounded, decent kids that we all want to push out into the world someday. Things like modesty and prudence and thrift, patience and perseverance for sure, gratitude, generosity, perseverance, and also curiosity, right? Perspective on your place in the world. And as I looked at that list that I made for myself, I thought, wait a second, you can use conversations about money to get to each and every one of those things. Right? So rather than being stumped into silence the way that I was in the car that day, rather than sort of bobbing and weaving and trying to avoid these pressing questions that our kids bring to us, what if we did the inverse? Right? What if we embraced every single one of those questions they were asking us about money and used them to steer our families on and towards years-long conversations, right? About values, about the things that we hold dear, right? Towards rituals even around spending and saving and giving. What if we did that instead? And what the opposite of spoiled turned into, more than almost anything else, was a solemn promise to our kids that we are going to do better at talking about this money stuff than our parents did. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, quite often if I had a question about money, especially when I talked to my dad, right, I'd get some version of the following answer: that, young man, is none of your business. How many of you heard something like that growing up? Yeah, okay, it's a pretty good chunk of the room. How many of you occasionally hear yourself saying the very same thing today? Thank you. Yeah, it happens to the best of us. So I'm here to tell you tonight that's probably not the best answer. One reason it's not a great answer is because it's not true, right? Our revenues, our expenses in our family business that it's supposedly none of their business of, right? Those revenues and expenses make a difference, right? They matter in terms of what we can have and what we can do. Our kids notice. It is absolutely their business whether we like it or not. But I think the other reason why we don't want to shut them down that way is if they come to the conclusion that an entire avenue of exploration and of curiosity is totally closed down to them because their parents don't want to go there, they may just naturally come to the conclusion that other difficult things are not even worth asking about in the first place, right? So if you shut the money conversation down, there's danger that they won't even come to you to talk about sex or drugs or whatever weird feelings they're having, right? And you don't want them to take those sex questions to Google, right? I don't know when the last time was you asked Google a sex question, but you should really, don't do that at work, because the results that pop up are problematic, right? And they may be problematic for your kids as well. So if you're trying to figure out, okay, well, what's the best way to answer that question then? Any of those questions? Yeah, I would suggest looking right back at a child who asks a money question and just saying this. That's a really great question. Why do you ask? Right? And it's not meant to be an accusation. Why do you ask? We're not criticizing them for being curious, but we actually really do want to know where this stuff is coming from, right? Often the younger ones, they're picking up stuff on the playground, right? Kids are using the word rich and they're wielding it as a weapon, right? That kid is behaving that way because that's a rich kid, right? Or maybe they're bragging about being rich. Right? Or, words that end with ILLION often get tossed around a lot among the younger set too, right? Illion this and illion that, and they come home wanting to know if you have $1 million, right? Or $1 billion, because somebody else said that they did. So the newspaper comes, right? And it's open on the table. There may be things in the newspaper that are not such good news. Right? Your kids may have questions about that. Questions may make them wonder about their safety and security. Or perhaps they're in your mail because you leave it around and they open it up and they're curious. Or if they're like me, they go into your file cabinets and they read your income tax return. Right? It's like my parents were splitting up and there were all these conversations about money, and so I thought I would get the answers by looking at the tax returns. I had no idea what any of it meant, right? But they will go looking for this stuff, especially if you are unwilling to answer their questions, right? So when it comes right down to it, what these money questions are often about more than almost anything is this. Mom, Dad, are we okay here? Are we normal? And if we're not normal, if we have more money or more stuff than most of the other people that we know, is that because we did something wrong? Or if we have less, right? If you won't let me have the basketball shoes or the iPhone or whatever it is that I want this week, is that because we're poor? And if we have less money than everybody else, is that because you did something wrong? That's what these questions come down to. And why do you ask will help you get there. It also happens to be a terrific stalling tactic, right? It's like you stop, you ask why do you ask, and you have like at least 15 seconds for the wheels to turn in your head to get cooking. All right, so these are the 3 jars. I put them on the cover of The Opposite of Spoiled for a reason. I like the fact, first of all, that they're sort of a stand-in for those values and virtues and character traits we were talking about before, right? Spending is about modesty and prudence and thrift. Saving is about delayed gratification in a world that totally conspires against waiting in children, right? We all had to wait around for so much stuff. Right? We had to wait in line at the amusement park. We had to wait through commercials, right? There's all this stuff that kids just don't even have to wait for anymore. But waiting turns out to be a really important grown-up skill. Saving, patience, delayed gratification. None of us are going to retire unless we spend a good 40 or 50 years putting money away slowly and methodically. So they better start learning that stuff soon, early, often, right? And then giving. Generosity, the tzedakah jar maybe in your house. That is about giving. So the question you may be asking yourself, right, is how soon is too soon, or when is the right time to start? Now, you may not have any choice in the matter, right? You may be like me, and the questions will start coming at the age of 3 or even sooner. Someone raised their hand at a JCC event in Manhattan about 1.5 years ago and said that her 2-year-old wanted to know, Mommy, why do you go to work when the other mommies don't go to work? Right? I thought that was a pretty amazing question coming from a 2-year-old. So it may come, way sooner than you think. But sometimes the kids are, not ready, say, for allowance. I don't make this stuff up. We're not allowed to make things up at the New York Times, and people tweet really, really crazy things at me. So, some of the kids think that the money is an art project. In my neighborhood, and probably in your neighborhood too, there is a Jewish ER doctor who is semi-officially on call by text for all of the neighbors. Dr. Dara Cass, maybe you know her. She's, one of these amazing ER cowboys who can fix anything at any time. So I never thought I would be in a position where I might need to fix something for Dara, but one day out of nowhere, I got this text from her, and she said, "Hey, Ron, I made a major parenting mistake involving money. I'm here in the ER at NYU. Can you guess what it is that happened?" And I'm thinking to myself, what could this possibly be? Don't eat the money. She forgot to tell her kid that, right? She started him on allowance at the age of 3, thinking that she was doing right, and he didn't really understand that you weren't supposed to put the quarters in your mouth, right? So stuff like this happens. Okay, so we're in the middle of a crazy tax conversation here in the United States right now. First big tax reform event, or attempt at least, in basically a generation. So you knew you weren't going to get away without a tax joke here. Kids are also aware of taxes sooner than you may think. And when I was in my kid's school, when she was in first grade, I walked in and saw this, right? So I thought, this is really interesting. This is actually kind of sophisticated. So like, what was this about? Because I'm a professional troublemaker, I took a picture of this and sent it to the kids' parents. And I said, what is this, right? And they said, we have no idea where you got this idea, that people should not have to pay higher taxes. 6 weeks later, they wrote me back and they said, "Ron, we think we figured it out. We were in Oliver's room cleaning up all the books off of his floor, and on the very bottom of the pile, we found the book where he got this idea." Can you guess what he might have been reading? What he was reading about? A historical event in Boston, Massachusetts. Yes, right? So it turns out Oliver did not have a problem with paying higher taxes. He just didn't want to pay higher taxes to the British. Now, the other thing about these jars, they're a great receptacle for allowance. Get a ton of questions about allowance. One I hear maybe most often of all is a question of, well, what should my kids have to do in exchange for the allowance? It's the old, do you pay them for chores, or do you expect them to do the chores for free question. I actually think the answer is pretty simple here, and it's sort of dictated by the fact that you don't want to put yourself in a bad negotiating position. Because if you do pay for chores, there may come a moment, months from now or years from now, when your child has saved a lot of money, and they come back at you and they say, I have enough money now for a while, and I'm not going to do the chores anymore. I'm not going to do them for months, in fact. And then you've created a difficult situation for yourself. So I think better to create the expectation that chores are done for free, that we all do things around the house because we love one another and we value an orderly living situation, right? And that money, allowance, is for practice, right? It's like a musical instrument or athletic equipment. These are things that we want our kids to get good at, and we want them to get good at money too, and that's why we give them some. And it goes into the spend jar, and into the save jar, and into the give jar. Now, that's not to say that I'm a softie about chores. I actually think kids are capable of way more than we give them credit for. We should ask them to do way more. And just to remind myself of what life is like outside of the bubble of Park Slope or Greenwich, Connecticut, I spent a bunch of time when I was reporting the opposite of spoiled with farm families. So I want to introduce you to Jebediah Smith. He is the youngest of 11 Smith brothers, all boys. They live on a dairy farm in northern Utah, 1,800 head of cattle. And when you turn 5, in the Smith family, you are promoted to tractor driver. Yeah, you laugh, right? I mean, I had exactly the same reaction. And so I had to go there to see this myself. And this is what happens. Jeb, every morning, every evening, he gets lifted up, put on that tractor, because he can't quite clamber up there on his own. And he puts the thing in gear, and off he goes, kind of holding on 1 mile per hour, trying to keep this thing straight. So he's got these long rows of calf pens, these little plastic houses where the baby cows live. And the baby cows all need to be fed. Moms are off in the milking barn, right? Baby cows need milk twice a day. So going along behind him as he sort of tootles down these rows are the 7-year-old brother and the 9-year-old brother. And they're taking these giant baby bottles out of the trailer behind the tractor, and they're dropping them in each individual calf pen so that the baby cows have milk to drink. So those bottles in the back were filled in the dairy barn by the 11 and 13-year-old brothers with the milk that was extracted from the cows by the 15 and the 17-year-old brothers who operate the milking machines. So this goes on, twice a day, 6 days a week. They take Sunday off. And that's one of Jeb's jobs. His other job involves that gun that he's holding. How many of your kids have guns? None. Shocking, right? So that gun is part of his job. Birds are a problem on dairy farms. They harass the cows, they spread disease, you don't want them around. So Jeb's job is to make sure that when the birds show up, they know to be really, really scared of him. And he picks up that BB gun and he cocks it, and once he starts spraying those little metal balls around, they know that it's time to go. He took 2 out of midair the day that I was there. So the birds know good and well that his job is to be really sharp with that weapon. So that's Jebediah Smith, age 5, tractor driver, bird shooter. So I ask you in all seriousness, right, what has your 5 or your 11 or your 15-year-old actually done for you in the last week? What of substance? Right? Now, I get that we don't all have dairy animals in the backyard. So the real question you may be asking yourself, right, is like, what of substance can I actually ask my kid to do? I struggled with this too, right? Maybe you outsource some of the household chores. That's fine. No judgments here, right? But there needs to be something important that the kids can do. We didn't figure this out until we were watching TV one night. We had gotten into MasterChef Junior. Yeah, so for those of you who don't know, it's a reality cooking show with a bunch of, super cute kids, ages 7, 9, 11, 13. And they compete against one another with Gordon Ramsay, that crazy yelling British chef dude, sort of presiding and judging. And they cook the most amazing stuff, beef Wellington and croquembouche. And after a couple episodes of this, our daughter, who was 8 years old at the time, turned around and looked at us as we were turning the TV off for the night, and she said, I could do that too. And we said, great, right? Because think about it. Think about, even if you really love to cook, right, just think about what a big chore cooking actually is. You have to provide 21 meals a week. And if your kids, if you have more than one, are picky, you're doing 42 meals a week, right? Or maybe more. That is a lot. There's absolutely no reason why a 7 or a 9 or an 11-year-old, after a couple of lessons and some supervision for a while with the stove cannot be producing his or her own meals. Most kids don't like super complicated stuff. And the ones who like super complicated stuff often like to learn to cook it. And that's what happened in our house. Our daughter's, fine with the savory stuff. She can make spaghetti and grilled cheese and eggs and, whatever she wants to eat. But when it's Hanukkah or somebody's birthday, she goes to town with baking. She's almost as good of a baker as my wife or I am at this point. And so, to me, the moral of that story is that your kids can and should be making you dinner. No, you laugh, right? But they are fully capable of doing this, and it's a real contribution to the household, and you should make them do it, right? So again, with the jars, practicing spending. This is a good opportunity, more than almost anything else, to begin to learn the difference and the distinction between wants and needs. When I began to look for a good way to explain this to myself and then hopefully to other people, it happened to be a point when I was doing a lot of reading and talking to a lot of people about what went on in schools. And for reasons I didn't understand and still don't quite understand, I kept hearing about these rain boots, hunter boots, that so many girls seem to have or seem to want, but they just kind of kept coming up in the reporting. And I realized that there was an opportunity there, right? Because every kid needs rain boots, right? We want their feet to stay dry when they're outside and it's raining. So that's all well and good, but just how much rain boot is enough in their lives, in our lives? So I made myself a little continuum, right? With the hunter boot, 70, 80, 90, $100 at retail, kind of over on the right side, on the want end of the continuum. And then over on the left side, we've got our basic wellies. $20 maybe, you could buy them at Target or Payless, right? The decision that we have to make in each and every one of our households is that where are we going to drop our our vertical line, right, through the horizontal want-need continuum. Now, I grew up in the Midwest. Land's End is an institution there. The catalog came over the transom kind of like clockwork. So what we decided in our household was that we were going to draw a Land's End line through the want-need continuum, right? And so if the kid needed Rain's boots, she could have the Land's End boots. And if she didn't like the Land's End boots at 40 or 45 bucks, she could take that 40 or 45 bucks and she could spend it elsewhere on some other pair of boots. But if she wanted the expensive boots, the hunter boots, way to the right of the Land's End line, she was going to have to come up with the extra 40 bucks from her allowance or some other way to pay for the difference herself. Right? She was going to have to make a trade-off, because only then would she really know how much she wanted it, unless she had to weigh it against some other priority of hers. So I was pretty proud of this, I have to be honest. I sort of dumped it into the first draft of my book. I'm rewriting it, and I come home one fall day, walk into the living room, and there's my daughter wearing these. I thought somebody at the publisher was playing a joke on me, but no, they were hers apparently. And I said, Talia, where did you get those boots? And she said, oh, Grandmommy got them for me. Grandparents are a menace, right? I mean, they just live to subvert all of our most strongly held feelings about how to do things with our kids, right? So, we had to make a decision at that point about, whether we were going to get rid of the boots. What we realized in that moment was that we needed some kind of banned item list in our household, where there were things that we would just not allow over the threshold, no matter who paid for them, right? And certainly some brands might fall onto that list, maybe things that are so extravagant that we would never let her wear them no matter what. And then there are some brands, some companies, whose values just don't overlap or correspond with ours, right? And so some of those companies we would not want her wearing or her involved with. But we finally decided that these didn't really belong on that list, right? If she had wanted to take an extra 40 bucks and sort of pitch in for the hunter boots that she wanted to buy, we totally would have let her do that. Now, a couple weeks after that, we got another test. A brown box arrived in the mail, and sure enough, we opened it that day, and there was a black leather miniskirt inside. Yeah, I had exactly that reaction. We show everybody that face? With your upper lip, right? I take thee back to the store. Off it went. Black leather miniskirts, definitely on the banned item list. And then about a year or two later, we got a much closer call. By then she was 9, roughly 10. And what she really wanted to do more than anything else is get an ombre. Am I saying it right? Yeah, she wanted to dye the bottom half of her hair. And we thought, all right, this is not permanent, so she'll still be able to be buried in a Jewish cemetery. It is her body. She wants to pay for the whole thing herself. So we thought, all right, this is the trick we're going to play on her. This is not going to be some Kool-Aid in the sink ombre, right? She's going to have to go where she usually goes to get her hair cut in Brooklyn. And she's going to have to pay whatever it costs to get this done. So she went, down the street and she got a quote from the salon. I don't know if they gave her like a 9 or 10-year-old discount or not. But she found out that it was going to cost, to do it all right, to, some of you women or men who have done this in the room, right, that the way that you do it right is that first you've got to like completely bleach out the bottom, and only then in like the second round do you apply the fancy dye. And like the fancier the dye, the longer it stays. And so the quote they gave her was $220. And she said, I'm in. Right? And so it was like a year of allowance money and every last dime of Hanukkah and birthday money. She didn't get any other presents. And then she went and did it. Yeah, exactly, right? Right? Look how happy she is, right? I mean, I wouldn't spend $220 on that. But, a big part of, and it's interesting, right? Is this a product or is this an experience, right? This is one of those things that kind of, sort of straddles the line. right? But part of getting to know ourselves better and for our kids getting to know themselves better is figuring out when spending a big pile of money will actually deliver an incredible return in happiness and when it'll feel like a total waste. So the interesting thing that happened here is that, she went off to camp like 6 weeks later or whatever, and by the time visiting day rolled around, it was just gone. I don't know if it was like the, lake water up there that did it, or this did not last very long, and yet she was totally thrilled that she had done it. She was proud that she'd saved the money. She was completely glad. So no obres on the banned item list in our house. Again, no judgments if you ban it in yours, but at each step along the way, you're going to be tested, right? And things will come on and things will fall off, and you should be prepared to defend yourself, right? Because I think we owe them an explanation. They don't have to like the explanation, but I think they're entitled to an answer to the question of why things are allowed or not allowed. Okay, one more time with the jars. Over on the left, you see the give jar. Maybe it's called the tzedakah jar in your house. We had a really hard time with this in our house. Our kid, the older one, had trouble figuring out why it was, at the age of 3 or 4, we were asking her to give away money, and we were doing a terrible job of explaining it. We said, well, we give in order to give back, right? Which is sort of an airy, meaningless phrase that doesn't make sense to a kid. And then we tried the whole God thing, right? We give because God commands us to give, because it's the right thing to do. I don't know how, intensely articulated your own personal relationships with God are at this particular moment, but with a 3 or a 5 or a 7-year-old, they're not really ready to kind of reckon with that, or at least most of them aren't. And so we didn't have it right, and we realized that we did not have it right for a while. And then one day we kind of seized on what we needed to do to explain it to her. We had not bothered explaining to her her own family's history of having been helped itself. So we tried to figure out what stories could we tell her from our own family that would help connect her to her inner giver. And it turns out that it didn't take us very long to realize that we had a whole bunch of really good ones. First of all, there was my story, which I already told you. I only got to stay at the best private school in Chicago because other people before me had given, so kids like me would not be evicted for lack of ability to pay. So because that happened when I was 12, by the time I was 13 and the bar mitzvah circuit started, I was still there with all of my friends who became my family, right? Not just doing the hora, but doing the worm. And those people, and the people who your kids are with in communities like this, they will stay with you for a really long time. Those guys and those girls from Francis Parker, there were 25 strong of them at my wedding. And quite often when I show up in random cities to give talks, some of them are out there looking back at me. These people have literally picked me up and carried me over their heads for my entire life. This was the basketball team at our 25th reunion not long ago. All these guys are still with me, right? So my daughter knows them, right? That's Uncle Colin in the Michael Jordan jersey, and that's Uncle Eric in the Brown jersey. She knows all these guys, and she has since the day she was born. So she knows that story, and she knows that all that happened because somebody else was generous. Now, my mom, the one I told you about, she is a 37-year survivor of premenopausal breast cancer. And when she was diagnosed back in the late 70s, when I was about 8 and my brother and sister were 2.5, 3, it was a death sentence for a lot of the women who got that diagnosis. But she was lucky, right? She was lucky that we were in Chicago, that we were near Northwestern University. She was lucky that a whole bunch of people who had not been lucky at all had given, so the people like me could still have a mom. So she lived. One of her best friends, Lynn Sage, did not live. About 18 months later, she got a really nasty case of breast cancer and did not live through it. Left a couple daughters behind who were 10 and 8 at the time. So my mom and her buddies, after the grieving was over, got together and they said, we're going to do everything we can to make sure that nothing like this ever happens to our daughters. And they scraped together some money, and that money became a bigger pile and a bigger pile and a bigger enterprise And 30 years later, it turned into the Lynn Sage Cancer Research Foundation, which now has an entire floor of research and treatment in the brand new Northwestern University Hospital building in downtown Chicago. These women have raised millions and millions and millions of dollars over 3 decades. And when it came time to do the 30th anniversary luncheon, they said, you know what we're going to do? Any of you who were involved in fundraising know about this, right? You throw these events and then you've got to do the ask, right? And you've got to try and inspire people to dig deeper, to reach farther, to write a bigger check than they've written before and the last time. They said, we're going to go to the 3rd generation of the Lynn Sage family. We're going to go to the grandchildren, the granddaughters in particular, of the original founders, and ask them to get up and make the ask. Now, not every kid wanted to do that, but my daughter said she was game, and so we all flew to Chicago on a Monday afternoon, and in front of 1,400 people in the Hilton Ballroom, the biggest hotel ballroom in the entire city, my kid got up there with her nanny, 37 years after she survived breast cancer. That's the 2 of them up at the podium there. My daughter's in pink, of course, and she made the ask, along with a couple other kids who were granddaughters of the founders. Those girls raised twice as much money in a single day than any luncheon had ever raised before in the history of the foundation, which is not to say much about my daughter's fundraising skills. She was good, but it just proves that you put a couple of kind of cute kids up on the podium and have them ask for money. It goes a long way with the people who are listening. So for those of you who want to steal that idea, you totally should, right? But now, you can bet that she knows the story of her nanny's history of having been helped herself. And then there's my wife's family. She comes from survivors. Her grandparents were chased across Europe by Hitler and his goons. He caught just about every last one of them. About 75% of them did not make it out alive. But some of them did. They kind of found one another and paired off in the refugee camps. This was them. A couple of years after the war ended, they were still trying to make their way out. And as those of you who sort of studied the history of post-World War II Europe know, it often took a while to find a place to go, to find a country that would take you. It took a couple more years after this for them to leave. And some of that was because of stereotypes. Maybe something like this looks familiar from your study of history, or maybe you've seen similar stereotypes of other refugees recently, right? I mean, for the Jews, it was the classic stuff, hooked noses and people who looked diseased and all the rest. And yet, Jodi's grandparents did make it out, and in 1949, they came through Boston Harbor and then ended up in New York City, and when they did, there was a line of refugee organizations waiting to help them, to get them set up with an apartment, to get them set up with furniture, to teach them where to go and how to shop. And her grandparents thrived. We lost Grandpa Anshel a couple years before I turned up on the scene, but just last weekend, Great-Grandma Hannah turned 95 years old. Yeah, stuff it, Adolf. So you can bet that my daughter knows the whole history. I mean, it's sort of seeped into her veins. We all have our own feelings about when and how we talk about the Holocaust. But there was really no avoiding the reality for our daughter. She learned about it, roughly at the age of 7 or 8. And now when she shows up to see Great-Grandma Hannah, who is getting on in years and can't see or hear very well, but still has all of her marbles, she often brings a tape recorder so she can actually download the stories directly from Grandma Hannah's brain, right? So that we never forget any of them. So you can bet that she knows her mother's family's history of having been helped itself. Now, maybe you don't come from survivors. Maybe you've got your own hardscrabble immigrant tale, though. Or maybe you're being treated right now, or someone in your family is, for a disease that might have killed you a generation ago. But it isn't going to now. You're going to live to parent another day or decade or another 50 years because somebody else was generous before you. Please tell your kids those stories. They will ask you for them again and again. I know ours does. And it will help get your kid in touch with their own inner giver. And it's a great way to sort of put them in touch with family history, too. So once we had done that, we realized it was high time for her to know how it was that we give and to whom. And so we started sitting down with her once a year to make it clear to her how we were dividing our household tzedakah budget. The first time we did it, we sat her down. We said, Tal, okay, for every $100 that we give away in this family, this is how we divide it up. We took 100 black beans and we dropped them on the table and we started making piles, right? We give to eradicate diseases half a world away where people don't have to die, where there's an easy cure, where with a couple $1,000s you can be absolutely guaranteed that you're going to save somebody's life. We feel like that's something well worth doing, right? And there are the schools that I attended and the schools my wife attended and the American Jewish World Service and organizations that we give to help elderly Jews like Grandma Hannah who may not have as much money, right? And so we showed all this to her. We said, all right, Tal, now that you've kind of seen all this, is there anything you think we've missed here? Is there something that's important to you that we've forgotten about? Because we felt like, this sort of allocation of our charitable resources, it was a statement of our values, of the things that are important to us. And that reflects on her too. So, why shouldn't she have a say in it? And she said, yeah, actually, I'm glad we give money to the schools that help Daddy when he didn't have enough. But the thing that I love doing the most each year is going to sleepaway camp. And so I'd like to give some money to the camp in case there's some kids who want to go who don't have enough money. So that seemed like a great idea to us. And so we started donating to the Camp Eisner Scholarship Fund. And so we said to her, all right, this year, 3 of the beans belong to you. So in other words, she was going to get to allocate 3% of our budget. But there was a catch. We told her we'd already set aside enough money, all the money that we could afford to give that year. And so she was going to have to take her 3 beans from other piles. In other words, she was going to have to make a decision about what we emphasized a little bit less to make room for her priority. So the conversation that ensued from there was she tried to figure out, which piles to take beans from to make room for the donation that she wanted to make was one of the best family conversations we have ever had. It was amazing to see her little brain sort of churn and try to figure out and apply different criteria, to figure out which things should be slightly less important. So we started that when she was 9 years old. We've done it every year since, and each year the conversation gets more and more interesting, right? Kids get smarter, they ask better questions, and the other thing that's incredible is that, their interests just change wildly over time. So we're always completely surprised when it happens. If you've never done anything like this, I strongly encourage you to do it as soon as possible. You will learn a ton about your kids. And again, they're ready for this sort of thing as soon as you think. Sooner than you think. This was a note that some friends of mine sent to me that their 6-year-old drew, actually after seeing some of those protests out in the world. They explained the Occupy protests to her just by saying, well, we're just having a conversation in New York right now because in New York there are some people who have way more than they need, and there's some people that have about what they need, and then there's also a lot of people who don't have all the things that they need, and we're just trying to figure out here whether that's fair, which I thought was a really good kind of politically neutral way of explaining it. So their daughter sat down at her art table and she invented a share machine to solve the problem. And the way she explained it to me, when I called her up, she said, yeah, you just take all of your gold and you put it into the pink funnel. It swirls down into the machine and it makes red coins and blue coins. And then the machine takes the red coins and the blue coins and it spits them out through the pink elephant truck. And then they just go all over the sidewalk in the streets of New York, and anybody who needs money can just come and take some. Yeah, I thought that was pretty good, right? Especially for a 6-year-old. They are ready to reckon with this stuff sooner than you think. And it doesn't just have to happen in the home. Some of you may be familiar with a day school in San Francisco called the Brandeis School. It used to be called the Brandeis Hillel School. I kept hearing when I was doing my reporting about this phenomenon known as the 7th grade fund. And what the 7th grade fund is, I traced it back to its origins, which was this school in San Francisco, where the 7th grade families just up and decided one year that they'd sort of had enough of the whole bar and bat mitzvah gift thing. And they felt like it was sort of meaningless, these $18 checks or random trinkets, and every weekend they were doing this and everybody was running around buying stuff, and the kids who were older didn't really remember the gifts that they'd gotten. None of it seemed particularly meaningful. So one of the one of the parents in that class, who was sort of the ringleader, he was a nonprofit professional in the Jewish community, professional fundraiser. And he said, you know what? He said, let's just take all of the money that we have been spending on gifts, or that we will spend for gifts in the next year. Let's just take all that money and put it into a giant pile, and then let the kids give it away. And everybody thought he was sort of crazy, right? But then everybody decided he was brilliant. And that pile grew from the $10,000 or $15,000 that was supposed to be the original gift budget that all of these families in this big class had. And people got so excited that they threw more money onto the pile. And that year, those 7th graders gave away $25,000. They had a foundation, essentially. And what started happening was very curious. Grown men and women in suits started showing up at lunch to present to the 12 and the 13-year-olds because they wanted the money. Right? And eventually the Brandeis School realized that this was such a powerful phenomenon that they literally rebuilt the entire 7th grade curriculum around the fund. And now every year at the school, there's a big ceremony at the end of the year, and the kids all have these giant checks, right? And all of these grown-ups come from all over the city to collect their giant checks. And it is just the most amazing thing you have ever seen. Right? So, maybe your 7th grade class is smaller, maybe your pile of money would be smaller, but it's an incredibly powerful thing. And, 10, 20, 30 years later, the kids still talk about it, right? So, you're going to do your level best, right, to create generous kids. But just because they turn out generous doesn't mean that they're not going to want things, right? And wanting things is no great sin. We're all covetous in one way or the other, and kids are especially so. And quite often the things that they want the most, that are most expensive, kind of starting at the age of 7 or 8 or 9, are iPhones. I walked into my daughter's school not long ago. They were doing a poetry unit, and the first line of the poem began with the words, "So much depends on." And one of the kids wrote about getting a phone, right? I mean, can you imagine? This is kind of how obsessed they are with getting these things. Not long after that, somebody got in touch with me out of the blue and said, hey, can I send you the PowerPoint presentation that my kid created without even asking us about why she should get a phone? And it just goes on and on, right? So you may ask, right, once you figure out when is the right time, the next question you have to ask is, what is the right phone? Well, what is the right phone? I mean, if you've determined that the kids actually need a phone, that they're being left out of texting, or you want to let them go do things by themselves and still be able to get in touch, that's fine. I think phones are a need at this point for kids. But maybe the right move is to give them your sort of first generation iPhone, right, with the wireless carrier that doesn't exist anymore, and just let them walk around with that brick that barely connects to Wi-Fi, and just sort of, let them suffer for a while, right? But in all seriousness, right, the question I think you have to ask yourself is, all right, well, they want that latest generation iPhone. Is that something they actually need? Do they need a data plan? Do they need internet on the go, or can they just connect to Wi-Fi where they are? Or do they even need to connect to Wi-Fi? Can they have a flip phone? I think the answer to that question is no, right? They don't need a data plan, at least for their first phone for the first couple of years. So if that's something they really want, and iPhones are not on your banned item list, maybe you make them pay for the difference between the dumb phone that only texts and makes phone calls that you're willing to pay for, and the smartphone that they desperately covet, because only then will you know how much they want it, right? I often get questions from parents in communities like mine and communities like yours, where people say, look, we moved here, we've put them in school for the best of intentions, and we don't look back on that with regret, but they are surrounded in this community by people who are a lot like them, people who have a lot of nice things, and we want them not to be experiencing that some of the time. And so my feeling about that is sort of the best way to kind of separate them from the nice trappings that often surround them throughout the year is sleepaway camp. I was looking for a camp that was very low to the ground, a place that might serve as a sort of spiritual delousing for, kids who might otherwise be surrounded by nice things during the year. I found it on an island, in the middle of a lake, in the middle of the state of Maine. It's a place called the Pine Island Camp. About 90 boys go there every summer. They're out there for 7 weeks. There's no half session. You can only get there by boat. And when you get off the boat, it is the boys, not the counselors, not the camp director, who give you the tour. They are very proud of this place. It has no electricity. It has no showers. They bathe naked in the lake with biodegradable soap for all the passing boaters to see. They've learned to avert their eyes over the years. There is no computer lab. There's not much electricity or running water to speak of except for in the kitchen. And the sort of the crowning point of the tour when you go to Pine Island is what they refer to as the perch. You walk up about 10 steps and then you go to the bathroom. This is it. The largest composting toilet I have ever seen in my entire life. It is all toilet and compost under there. About 12 square feet of it. You can imagine how the place smells. It smells better than you might think, but it doesn't smell so great in there. And it took me like 10 minutes to get a picture when there weren't boys like sort of sitting and standing there. They have this beautiful view of the lake. It's kind of like a screened-in porch in there. But I sort of couldn't believe it, right? And everybody just sort of is in there casually doing their thing. And so when I sat down with Ben Swan, the camp director, in his little cabin on the island, I said, Ben, what is up with those bathrooms with no doors? And he said, Ron, he said, you have to understand something about this place. Every year we get at least a couple kids from New Canaan, Connecticut. Why does everybody make fun of New Canaan? Come on. He said, Ron, the thing about New Canaan that you have to understand is that nobody needs you in New Canaan. But here on the island, where there's only 80 or 90 of us, and there's no electricity, and we have no computers, and there's no spring-loaded aerobics floor, or jet skis, or water skis, or anything like that, the only fun we're going to have here is the fun that we make together. And for that to happen, every single kid is needed. And as soon as he said that, it all made sense to me, right? Because for all of the nice things our kids may be surrounded with during the year, when they go to a place like that or some other camp where there are not a lot of trappings, there are not a lot of features, what they learn very quickly is that they don't actually need all that stuff. They don't need the phone that they left behind. They don't need the computer. They don't need the hoverboard. They don't need whatever it is that they wanted last week that they're going to abandon next week in exchange for something else, right? The only thing they need are fellow human beings who they love and can rely on. And that, to me, is the most amazing lesson of an incredible sleeping way camp, right? They don't even need doors on the bathroom. So you're going to get a ton of questions over time, and they're only going to get more pressing as your kids get older. I urge you not to turn those questions and those kids away. Curiosity is a trait to be valued and cherished. All we're trying to do, right, is turn these little people into adults. And a big part of becoming an adult is figuring out how money works. And the only way they're going to be able to figure out is by asking the people they love and trust the most and hoping they're not going to get shut down. So when those questions come, stop, take a deep breath, try and find out why they're asking, smile, think, and give them a realistic, truthful answer that they can understand. And if you do that, I promise you, all of your families are going to be richer for it. Thank you.
Pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jim, To Jim, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.